The day Sarah gave birth should have been filled with joy, but instead, it was a moment of overwhelming fear and confusion. As she held her newborn in her arms for the first time, there was no rush of love or happiness, just a deep sense of dread. Her baby, tiny and fragile, looked up at her, but Sarah could only feel anxiety and panic. She had expected to feel an immediate bond, but all she felt was fear. The room around her seemed to fade away as her thoughts raced. She looked at her baby and thought, how can I do this? How can I raise a child when I'm barely holding it together myself? The weight of the responsibility was too much. The world felt like it was closing in on her. Her heart raced as the reality of the situation hit her. She had to take care of a baby, but she didn't feel ready. She didn't feel strong enough. As Sarah looked at her newborn, the room felt suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was failing. She had always dreamed of being a mother, but now that it was real, it felt like a nightmare. She tried to focus on the baby, to feel the love she thought was supposed to come naturally, but the emotions were too overwhelming. Fear, confusion, and doubt flooded her mind. She felt like she was drowning, and no one seemed to understand. Sarah was trying to be strong, but it was impossible to ignore the growing panic inside her. She felt alone, even though she was surrounded by doctors and nurses. The baby was safe in her arms, but she didn't feel like she could protect it. The fear of what the future would bring weighed heavily on her, and in that moment, she couldn't imagine being the mother her child deserved. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay. The decision was heartbreaking, but it felt like the only choice. With tears streaming down her face, she slowly stood up and placed the baby in the care of the nurses. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her body felt numb as she walked away. The hospital room seemed to blur as Sarah quietly left. She didn't say anything to anyone. No one stopped her, as though they too were in shock, unsure of what to say or do. Her mind was filled with doubt and fear, but she believed that by leaving, she was doing what was best for her child. Maybe, she thought, the baby would be better off with someone who could care for it fully, someone who wasn't struggling like she was. As Sarah walked through the hospital halls, she couldn't look back. The decision had been made, but the pain of leaving her newborn behind was unbearable. The tears came harder now, but she didn't know how to stop them. The weight of what she had just done was crushing her, but she couldn't see any other way out. Her decision left everyone speechless. Nurses and doctors who had been caring for her, who had tried to offer support, couldn't understand how a mother could walk away from her own child. There was no yelling, no shouting, just silence. Sarah's quiet departure was far more haunting than any words could have been. How could a mother do this? How could she leave her own flesh and blood behind? It was a moment that no one would ever forget. Everyone in the hospital, from the staff to the few witnesses, was left in shock. But for Sarah, it was the hardest decision she had ever made, one she believed was the only choice in that moment of fear and confusion. As soon as Sarah left the hospital room, the staff began to notice. It was quiet at first, just the usual sounds of a busy hospital, but then the realization hit. The baby was still in the nursery, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. Nurses went into the room to check, expecting to see her there, but she was gone. There was no note, no explanation, just an empty bed. The hospital staff was stunned. Doctors quickly began to gather, talking in hushed tones, trying to figure out what had happened. "Where did she go?" one of the nurses asked. "Has anyone seen her?" There was a rush of confusion as people started to search the hallways. Staff members went to check Sarah's room, hoping to find her, but she wasn't there. The quiet urgency grew into panic. Everyone who had interacted with Sarah during her stay knew something was off. She had seemed distant, distracted, and somewhat disconnected after giving birth, but no one had expected this. The nurses who had cared for her were left in disbelief. One of them, still holding the baby in the nursery, asked aloud, "Why would she leave? They had done everything they could to reassure her, offering help, guidance, and support. How had it come to this? The doctors who had spoken with Sarah during her stay were equally shaken. They had noticed her anxiety and had tried to offer resources and comfort. But they never imagined this would happen. It was a tragedy no one had seen coming. In the back of their minds, they all wondered if they had missed something. Could they have done more? Had they somehow failed Sarah? The feeling of helplessness spread among the staff as they continued to search for her, hoping she was still somewhere in the hospital, that maybe she just needed some space. But no one knew where she had gone. As Sarah left the hospital, she passed through the hallways without anyone stopping her. A few people in the corridor noticed her walking by, her head down, her face covered with tears. They didn't know her story, but they could sense the weight of her decision. She moved quietly, almost as if she were in a daze, walking with a slow, heavy step. A couple of hospital visitors glanced up as she walked past. They didn't say anything at first, unsure of what they were seeing. One of them turned to the other and whispered, "Isn't that the woman who just had a baby?" But before the other could respond, Sarah was gone, out of sight. The silence in the hallways was broken only by the soft murmur of conversations and the shuffle of footsteps as nurses and staff rushed to find Sarah. But for the few bystanders who had witnessed her departure, the moment was surreal. They could tell something wasn't right, but they couldn't fully understand it. Some of them exchanged confused looks, not sure how to react to what they had just seen. They couldn't make sense of it. How could a mother leave her own child like that? The hospital, a place of healing, now felt filled with uncertainty. The air seemed thick with unspoken questions. In the moments after Sarah's departure, the hospital hallways felt eerily quiet. No one knew what had just happened or why, but everyone could feel the weight of it. "It's so sad," one of the bystanders muttered to a nurse passing by. "I don't understand how she could do it." The nurse, equally shaken, just nodded, her face full of sorrow and confusion. The feeling in the hospital that day was one of shock and disbelief. No one knew what to say, but everyone felt the emotional burden of Sarah's decision. It was a tragedy that no one could have predicted. For Sarah, the decision she made haunted her every day. The guilt never left her. She constantly replayed that moment in her mind, asking herself if she had done the right thing. She felt as though she had failed her baby, and the shame weighed heavily on her heart. The feeling of abandonment lingered, not just for the baby but for herself too. She couldn't escape the thoughts that kept her awake at night. She knew she had left, but the emotional scars of that decision were far deeper than she realized. As time passed, Sarah tried to move forward, but the emotional burden was always with her. She sought therapy in an attempt to heal from the trauma she had experienced. Talking with a counselor, Sarah was able to begin processing the guilt and shame that had built up inside her. She worked on understanding her emotions and why she had felt so overwhelmed that she couldn't care for her baby. It wasn't an easy journey, but slowly, she began to understand that her decision had been made in a moment of intense pain and fear. It wasn't a reflection of her love for her child, but rather the result of the emotional and mental weight she was carrying. She tried to make amends where she could, seeking ways to rebuild her relationship with her child, though the road to healing was long and difficult. But Sarah had learned that healing takes time, and she was willing to do the work, no matter how challenging. The baby, placed in the hospital's care, was safe. But the emotional toll of abandonment would not disappear easily. The trauma of being left by her mother in those early, formative days could have a lasting impact. Early childhood trauma, even in infants, can shape a child's development in ways that aren't immediately visible. Children who experience abandonment may have difficulty forming secure attachments with others later in life. They might struggle with trust, and their emotional development could be affected by the absence of their primary caregiver. The baby may not fully understand the situation now, but the emotional scars could show up later as the child grows older. The hospital did its best to care for the baby, but the long-term emotional effects of being abandoned by a mother are not so easily erased. Healing would require time, love, and consistent care, but the impact of that first rejection could echo throughout the child's life. The hospital staff, who had cared for Sarah and her baby, were also deeply affected by the event. Doctors and nurses who had worked hard to support Sarah felt the weight of her decision. They had tried to help, but they didn't see the signs of her emotional struggles until it was too late. After Sarah left, many of them sat down in silence, reflecting on what had happened. They couldn't understand how a mother could leave her child, but they also realized that Sarah had been in a place of immense pain. The emotional toll of witnessing her departure affected everyone involved. The nurses who had built a rapport with Sarah, who had tried to comfort her, felt a deep sense of helplessness. They had done what they could, but it didn't feel like enough. The staff knew that this wasn't just a tragedy for Sarah and her baby, it was a tragedy for everyone. The guilt they felt wasn't theirs to carry, but the emotional impact of seeing a mother walk away from her newborn was something none of them would ever forget. This event made them realize how much more needs to be done to support mothers struggling with mental health and emotional challenges. It was a lesson learned the hard way, but one that would shape their approach to care in the future. Though Sarah's story is heartbreaking, it's important to remember that there is always help available. No one should have to face such struggles alone. There are many support systems in place that can offer the assistance and guidance mothers like Sarah need. Mental health hotlines, counseling services, and community programs exist to provide the support that can make a real difference. These resources are there to help mothers who feel overwhelmed, alone, or trapped by their emotions. Counselors, social workers, and support groups are ready to listen, offer advice, and connect mothers to services that can help them regain their strength. Adoption agencies also provide options for mothers who may not feel able to care for their child, ensuring that the child finds a loving, safe home. The key is reaching out. Help is there, but it's often difficult for those struggling to ask for it. If you or someone you know is struggling, don't hesitate to reach out. There are people who care and want to help. You are not alone. Whether it's through a hotline, a local support group, or therapy, there are resources available to guide you through tough times. We need to end the stigma around asking for help. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to ask for support. Let's come together to build a support system for mothers everywhere, so no one has to feel isolated or unsupported during their most vulnerable moments. Sarah, with time, found the courage to seek help. She started attending therapy sessions and reached out to local support groups for mothers in need. Slowly but surely, she began to rebuild her life and heal from the emotional wounds. She reconnected with her child, and together, they started a new chapter. Though it wasn't easy, Sarah learned that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the first step toward recovery. Her journey showed that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope for a brighter future. Thank you for watching. If you or someone you know is struggling, please remember that help is available. Reach out to mental health hotlines, adoption agencies, or local support groups. You don't have to face this alone.